The morning smelled of smoke and iron. Frost clung to the gallows beam, the rope swaying gently in the early breeze. A crowd still lingered in the town square, their boots leaving shallow prints in the cold dirt, their faces pale with the weight of what they had witnessed. Sheriff Cain stood at the foot of the scaffold, broad-shouldered, his long duster heavy with dust and law. His reputation hung heavier than the noose itself. To most, he was justice carved in human form, decisive, merciless, untouchable. Silence rippled over the square when a figure broke from the edges of the crowd. A woman in black, her veil catching the wind. Clara Monroe, the widow. Her boots struck the earth with the certainty of someone walking to the grave. She stopped before Cain, lifting her chin so that her eyes caught the dim winter light. The townsfolk held their breath, waiting for her to cry, to curse, to crumble. Instead, her voice cut through the air like a blade. "I'm not afraid to die." For the first time in his long years of iron law, Sheriff Cain blinked, and the silence of the town deepened. Backstory and emotional investment. Clara Monroe had not always been so fearless. Once, she had been a farmer's wife, tending soil and chickens with hands that smelled of earth and rosemary. She had known laughter on summer evenings, the sound of her husband Samuel's fiddle carrying over the golden fields. But those days had ended the night Cain's deputies rode out to her farm. Samuel Monroe had been accused of hiding a wanted man, one of Cain's rivals, a bandit who had slipped through the cracks of the law. Clara knew it wasn't true. Samuel had been too honest, too proud to risk such a crime. Yet Cain's deputies fired before Samuel could raise his hands. They called it justice. They called it lawful order. They left his body in the dirt and Clara in the ruins of her world. Since then, whispers followed her through town like shadows. Some pitied her, shaking their heads at her misfortune. Others feared her stubborn refusal to leave, muttering that the widow would bring Cain's wrath down on anyone who stood too close. Her farm stood at the edge of survival, roof leaking, soil hard, wolves prowling at the edges of her pasture at night. And yet Clara clung to it, the last remnant of her husband's hands. Every morning she rose with the same choice, to yield to despair or to fight. And though she felt the weight of grief like stones in her chest, she chose fight. Always fight. Perhaps that was why she walked into the square that morning. Perhaps that was why, in the shadow of Cain's gallows, she stood tall when others bowed. The crowd whispered as she faced him, unflinching. A widow against a sheriff. A woman with nothing against a man with everything. Tension with Sheriff. Sheriff Cain studied her, his jaw hard, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. He had faced outlaws with guns drawn, mobs ready to lynch, killers who spat death with their dying breath. None had unsettled him as much as the quiet defiance of a widow who should have been broken. "You ought to watch your tongue," Cain said at last, his voice low, gravel worn by years of command. "Words like that can dig a grave quicker than a shovel." Clara's gaze did not waver. "Dig it, then. My husband lies in one already by your order." A murmur swept the onlookers. The sheriff's deputies shifted uneasily, hands brushing the grips of their revolvers. Cain stepped closer, his shadow swallowing hers. "You think defiance makes you strong? All it makes you is a mark. I can turn this town against you with a word." Her hands clenched at her sides, but her voice was steady. "Then speak it. If you want me gone, send me to him. I'm not afraid to join my husband. Not afraid to die. Not anymore." Cain's stare locked with hers, and something unseen passed between them. He saw not weakness, but a mirror of something long buried in himself. For the first time, he hesitated. Conflict layers introduced. The days that followed drew invisible battle lines. Man versus man. Cain's deputies began to circle Clara's land. They claimed it was patrol, but she knew better. She could feel their eyes watching from the tree line, their laughter drifting across the fields at night. They were waiting, daring her to falter. Man versus nature. The land turned cruel as winter deepened. Storms rolled in, drowning her crops, tearing shingles from the roof. At night, wolves howled near the barn, their eyes glinting in the dark as they crept closer to the livestock. Each time Clara drove them off, she thought of Samuel, how his strong hands had steadied her rifle, how his steady voice had kept fear from her heart. Now, she stood alone against the wilderness, man versus self. But her greatest struggle lay inside her own chest. Each night, when she lay alone in the drafty cabin, her thoughts whispered that Samuel was waiting, that death would be easier than this endless war. More than once, she caught herself staring at his pistol above the mantel, wondering if courage was simply letting go. Yet every morning she rose again, dragged herself to the fields, and fought to keep what was hers. The fire in her heart burned, even as it consumed her. One evening, as the last of the light bled from the sky, she caught sight of Cain watching her from the ridge above her farm. His voice carried on the wind, a warning cloaked in gravel. "Careful what you wish for, widow. This land don't forgive the proud." She stared back until he rode away. That night, the wolves did not come, but men did. Shadows slipped from the trees, torches in hand. Her barn roared with sudden fire, the animals screaming inside. Clara stumbled into the smoke, fighting to save what she could. She barely escaped alive, collapsing on the prairie road. Above her, silhouetted by firelight on the ridge, stood a lone figure, silent, watching. When Clara woke, she thought at first she had crossed into death. The air smelled of pine smoke and spruce resin. Shadows of firelight flickered along the log walls of a small cabin. She lay wrapped in heavy furs, her lungs burning from the smoke she had inhaled, her body trembling with exhaustion. For a moment, she reached out, expecting to feel Samuel's hand, but instead, she touched rough, unfamiliar cloth, a blanket stitched with beadwork. A figure moved in the corner, tall, broad-shouldered. His presence filled the small room without a word. His skin was scarred, his hair bound back in a long braid. His eyes, dark and steady, watched her like a hawk measuring prey. He said nothing. Instead, he placed a wooden bowl of broth beside her and gestured for her to eat. His movements were deliberate, calm, as if he had already weighed the risks of saving her. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. "Who?" His gaze silenced her. He was no settler, no deputy, a Lakota warrior, marked by years of war. When she coughed and nearly spilled the bowl, he steadied her hand with his own. His palm was calloused, warm, grounding. And though no words passed between them, Clara knew this man had pulled her from the fire. He had saved her. Survival and bonding. The days that followed blurred into the rhythms of wilderness. Clara regained her strength slowly. The man, he had not given his name, but she heard it whispered in town once. Talon rarely spoke. His voice was low when he did, more like stone shifting than words. Instead, he taught through silence. He showed her how to split kindling that would catch quickly in wet air, how to tie cedar branches so smoke would not betray their fire. At night, she lay awake, listening to the world outside the cabin. Wolves padded close, their growls humming low. The first time their howls pierced the dark, she reached for Samuel's pistol with trembling hands. But before she could rise, Talon was already at the door, bow in hand, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight. When dawn came, he returned with a wolf's pelt, blood still steaming. He said nothing, only tossed it near her feet. She understood. A gift, protection, proof that he would not let the wild take her. Storms followed. A rain came that seemed to split the earth, flooding low ground and sending trees cracking into the ravines. Clara struggled in the mud, trying to secure the horses, when the current nearly pulled her under. Talon's hand shot out, gripping her wrist like iron. He hauled her to higher ground, but not before the flood slammed him against a boulder. That night she tended his wounds, binding them with strips torn from her own skirt. His jaw tightened with pain, but he did not push her away. She worked in silence, her hands steady, remembering Samuel's steady instructions when she once stitched his hand after a plow accident. "Don't cower," Samuel had said. "Fear feeds on weakness." She did not cower now. Later, when a mountain lion stalked the cabin, Clara's courage was tested again. The beast prowled into the clearing, eyes burning gold in the firelight. Talon moved for his bow, but Clara raised the rifle first. Her shot rang out sharp and true, driving the beast back into the trees. Talon's eyes met hers then, not cold, but measuring, as though seeing her for the first time not as a burden, but as someone who could stand. Their bond was wordless, carved in the small exchanges of survival. Her tending his wounds, his teaching her to find water in stone cracks, her fire steady when his hand trembled with fever, his bow ready when shadows circled the cabin. In those days, they became something unspoken, not friends, not strangers, something forged by necessity, sharpened by respect. Shared pain revealed. It was not until the third night, as rain beat against the cabin roof, that Clara heard his voice beyond commands. He sat near the fire, sharpening his knife, the scars on his chest lit by the flickering glow. His eyes stayed fixed on the blade when he spoke. "I had a son." The words startled her more than the thunder. Clara said nothing, waiting. "He was 5, taken when the soldiers came. They burned the lodge. My wife with him." His hand tightened on the knife hilt until the veins in his wrist stood out. No grave, no names spoken in the wind, only ash. Clara's breath caught. Her throat ached as though she, too, were choking on smoke from that fire. "My husband," she whispered, "shot in the dirt, by the sheriff's men, left him for me to bury." Talon's gaze finally lifted to hers. 2 broken lives reflected in the silence between them. For a long while, neither spoke. The storm raged outside, wind clawing at the cabin. Then, in the quiet that followed, something shifted. They were no longer 2 strangers thrown together by chance. They were kin by loss, bound by grief neither had chosen. The fire popped, sparks rising. Talon bowed his head slightly, an acknowledgement not of her pain, but of the strength it had taken to speak it aloud. And for the first time, Clara did not feel alone. Rising stakes. While the wilderness hardened Clara and Talon into unlikely allies, the world beyond their cabin did not sleep. Word reached Sheriff Cain that the widow had survived the fire. He spat when he heard it, anger boiling in his gut. Clara Monroe had defied the gallows, the flames, and now his grip on the town itself. "She's no longer a widow," Cain told his deputies. "She's a fugitive, and anyone harboring her will hang beside her." A posse was raised, men eager to curry favor, their rifles oiled and ready. They spread into the hills, eyes sharp for smoke trails, boot tracks, whispers of movement in the underbrush. One evening, Talon returned from scouting with his bow still in hand, his face hard. "They come." Clara's heart hammered, but she did not falter. She had known this reckoning would come. The sheriff would never allow her defiance to stand. She looked around the cabin that had been her shelter, then at Talon's scarred face. She had a choice: keep running deeper into the wilderness with this man, or return to town and face Cain openly. "I won't run forever," she whispered. Talon only nodded. Cliffhanger. The choice was stolen from her. Cain's men found them before dawn, torches flaring through the rain. Gunfire split the night. Trees cracked with bullets as Clara and Talon fled through the forest, mud sucking at their boots. At last they reached a canyon rim, the posse closing in. Breathless, Clara turned to Talon. "If I fall, don't you dare save me." I told him, "I'm not afraid to die." The first shots cracked just as the horizon bled pale light. Smoke curled against the canyon walls, echoing each gunshot until it sounded like thunder rolling through stone. Horses screamed and reared, hooves scattering rock and mud. Cain's men poured into the ravine, rifles raised, eyes gleaming with the promise of blood. Clara and Talon took their stand where the canyon narrowed, the cliff edge at their backs. The wilderness stretched wide behind them. There was no retreat left, only fight or fall. Talon's arrows hissed into the morning, striking true. One rider tumbled from his horse, another fell clutching his chest. Clara raised her revolver, her arm steady despite the tremor in her lungs. The first shot grazed a deputy's shoulder. The second shattered the torch in his hand, sparks bursting in the rain. The posse roared, charging harder. They came like wolves, snapping and snarling, mud flying beneath their boots. Clara dropped to one knee, firing again and again. Empty shells clattered to the stone. Talon fought beside her like a shadow unbroken, knife flashing, bowstring singing, his body moving with the deadly rhythm of someone who had faced death too many times to fear it anymore. But the posse was many, and the canyon closed around them like a noose. A bullet ripped across Clara's arm, hot pain blooming. She staggered, teeth gritted, but refused to fall. Talon pulled her back, his own shoulder bleeding from a shot that had torn clean through. Through the chaos, Sheriff Cain rode forward. His horse kicked up mud, his black duster soaked, his revolver gleaming in the rising sun. His face was carved in stone, but his eyes burned cold fire. He dismounted slow, deliberate, every motion meant to draw their fear. "Thought you could run, widow?" His voice carried over the storm of gunfire. "Thought you could hide behind ghosts and savages?" Clara lifted her chin, breath ragged, revolver still in her grip. "I'm still standing, Cain." He sneered. "Standing don't make you strong. You're broken. You always were. Without your man, you're nothing. Just a widow clinging to ashes." His words sliced sharper than the bullets. For a moment, the weight of Samuel's absence crashed over her. His voice, his touch, the warmth of his fiddle under the stars. But grief did not bend her now. It steeled her. She stepped forward, boots sinking in the mud, her revolver aimed at the man who had stolen everything from her. The moment of truth. The canyon stilled. The gunfire faded. Even the rain seemed to hold its breath. Clara stood face to face with Cain. His men waited behind him, rifles ready, eyes darting between the two figures locked in silence. Her heart thundered, but her voice rang clear. "I told you once," she said, each word slicing through the air. "I'm not afraid to die." She raised her revolver higher, the barrel steady despite the blood dripping from her arm. "But are you?" Her voice carried over the canyon walls, echoing into every ear. The words were not just for Cain. They were for every man behind him, every villager who whispered in fear, every soul who had bowed beneath his law. Cain's eyes flickered, his jaw clenched, his hand tightened on his gun, but it shook. For the first time in his reign of iron, the sheriff faltered. Clara stepped closer. "All these years, you've silenced others with the rope, the bullet, the badge. But you, Cain, you've lived a coward's life, and now everyone can see it." A murmur rippled through the posse. Men shifted, uneasy, doubt seeding in their eyes. Cain's face twisted with rage. He lifted his revolver, but his hand trembled so violently the barrel wavered. And in that moment, Silence crushed him. The man who had silenced hundreds could no longer silence her. Resolution. The fight drained from Cain before the bullet ever left his gun. His revolver sagged in his grip, the weight too heavy for the hand that once ruled with it. Around him, the posse hesitated, the law's iron facade cracking before their eyes. One man lowered his rifle, another turned his horse, shame in his posture. Within moments, several riders were retreating, their loyalty dissolving into the mud. Cain stumbled forward, breath ragged. "Do it!" he hissed, eyes bloodshot, spittle on his lips. "Pull the trigger. Finish what you started." Clara aimed steady, every nerve in her body taut. She could end him now. The man who had slaughtered her husband, burned her farm, poisoned her name. She could give Samuel peace, but she didn't. "No," she said softly, lowering the revolver. "Death's too easy for men like you. Living with the silence, that's the punishment." Cain's knees buckled. He collapsed into the mud, his gun slipping from his hand. No bullet needed. His power was broken. Talon touched Clara's shoulder, steadying her as her strength gave way. Together, they turned from the canyon, leaving Cain choking on his defeat. The lawman had been silenced, not by death, but by truth. Bittersweet ending. Clara returned to her farm with scars across her body and fire in her spirit. The barn was ash, the fields bruised by storm, but the land still lived. And so did she. She rebuilt with hands hardened by loss, guided by the memory of Samuel's strength. The wolves would come again. Storms would rip shingles free. Men would try to claim what wasn't theirs. But fear no longer lived in her chest. As for Talon, he stayed only long enough to see her stand on her own feet once more. Then, one morning, she found the cabin empty. His trail led west, fading into the endless pines. He left her no words, only silence. And in that silence lay respect, and a bond that needed no name. And so, when she said, "I'm not afraid to die," it wasn't defiance, it was freedom. If you felt Clara's story, leave a comment, share it, and subscribe. Because sometimes the voices of the past still echo in us today, reminding us that courage is louder than fear.